Welcome to TechEd 2004. Here you are at the Cabana booth for BizTalk server. I'm Scott Woodgate. Good to see you again. One of the big pieces of news from TechEd this year is the WSE 2.0 support that we've added. Web Services Enhancements 2.0 was announced in the Steve Ballmer keynote yesterday. And of course, it gives you the ability to create web services using WS policy and WS security. WSE 2.0 is a second release of the product, and it has the same support cycle as VS.NET 2003. So we expect a lot of people building service-oriented architectures will take advantage of WSE 2.0. Now, one of the cool things we've done on the BizTalk server team is make it easy to plug and play secure web services by building on top of the base WSE 2.0 infrastructure an adapter. So in fact, what we've made available to customers at TechEd today is the technical preview of the BizTalk server adapter for WSE 2.0. So what does this adapter do? Well, just like today out of the box with BizTalk server, you can consume web services and put those together inside a business process. We can do that same functionality now with secure web services using WS policy and the WSE adapter. And the second key scenario is really once you've created a business process, maybe it's a procurement business process, you might want to have customers submitting orders to that procurement business process through a web service. Of course, out of the box with the BizTalk publishing wizard for web services, you can get that functionality. Well, what we've done today with our technical preview of our BizTalk server adapter for WSE 2.0 is created a very similar wizard to the base wizard, but enables you to publish securely through web services BizTalk server orchestrations. So that's a little bit about the BizTalk server adapter for WSE 2.0. Let's get into some demos and see what it can do.
So here we are inside VisualStudio.net. And I have open inside VisualStudio.net the C# project that ships with WSE 2.0 called the username signing sample. What the username signing sample does is it exposes a web service called the stock service that accepts both a payload and then a username signature using the WS security conventions to effectively password protect the information on side of that web service. What you see here in the code, which isn't particularly important, is the client code that calls that web service passing in a base 64 encoded password in this particular example. When I go and have a look at the web service that is built, once again from the quick starts in WSE 2.0, you'll see the stock service with a single method, which is the stock quote request method. And when I go ahead and expand that inside Internet Explorer, we will see that the web service requires symbol information. What is the stock that you wish to get information on, Fabricam, Microsoft, and so on. And then returns back stock information, symbol, quote information. And once again, access to this web service is secured by, in this case, username token security. Of course, WSE provides any number of options for security, including certificates, but in this case, we have username token. And I've written a little silly application here that just simply base 64 encodes my username as a password so that I can drive the username tokens that this web service requires. Effectively, if I use this for my username, then I'm going to substitute that for my password. The WSE-based sample, of course, calls directly from C# to this secured web service. But what if I had to call this web service as part of a business process? How would I go about doing that? Well, let's go back into Visual Studio and take a look at how we would do that. So if I go into the Visual Studio environment, come out of a C# project, I can go into a BizTalk project. And inside my BizTalk project, I'm going to add a new orchestration and point that orchestration to my WSE-based web service. Now, if this was a traditional ASP.NET web service, I'd just simply do add web reference. The add web reference functionality isn't extensible. So for the WSE-based web services, we have the same type of functional experience that you have when you're adding an adapter. In this case, you do add generated items. We go ahead and select which adapter we're using, and because BizTalk Server is shipping this WSE 2.0 adapter in technology preview today, you can see that WSE 2.0 adapter is available to me on the list of adapters. And now I can do an experience that's very similar to add generated items, but is applicable to all adapters. So I'm going to take the URL for that web service. I'll just copy and paste that URL and drop it into the appropriate dialog box. For the technical preview version of this product, it's important to put $WSDL at the end of your ASMX file. If you just put the ASMX, it won't work. As we go through to production, you will not need $WSDL. What you can see on the remainder of this dialog box are things like the authentication type and client certificate and proxy. It's important to not confuse this information, which is generic IIS settings, with the WS security specific information that we'll see in a minute. This is not WS security specific information. This is information like, for instance, on the vRoot of IIS, am I using basic authentication to protect that vRoot, or is it authenticated? Do I have client certificates on my browser, or of course from a BizTalk perspective, when I'm calling out to the target, do I have an internal proxy? None of this stuff is specific to WS security. So once I press next, and in a similar way as add web reference, BizTalk Server uses the WSE 2 functionality, goes out, queries the metadata of the web service, and brings in the methods from that web service. So here you see that stock service and the stock request method are available to me. I choose next to select it, and at this point I can either configure a web services policy or not configure a web services policy. Remember, I am first picking up the information from the web service itself, and then because I'm using WSE 2.0 and I'm using WS policy, I might have a policy file that refers to this web service. And in fact, in this case, my policy is all about using username token signing. Now, you would imagine that it would be a sensible idea to have a third option here, which would be import an existing policy file. For the technical preview of the product, there is no ability to import an existing policy file, although we'll probably do that before we RTM the product. What we do instead is just interactively define the policy file for that web service. So let's go ahead and define it. So if we configure the policy file, what you can see here is I'm setting up the policy file specifically to security aspects of the policy file across the request. That's the message I'm sending to the web service, the response which comes back from the web service, and maybe a fault message that comes back. For each one of those particular tabs, I can set up a set of signature and encryption information. For the WSE examples that ship out of the box, and none of them use anything to do with response messages. So we'll just set it up for the request tab. What are my options here? From a signing perspective, I can use username signing. In fact, that's exactly what I will do in this example in a minute when I save it. I can also, of course, use Kerberos, and I can use X509 certificates. If I use X509 certificates, and then by pressing the ellipsis on the certificate tray, you can see I have access to certificates that have already been stored in my Windows 2000 or 2003 or XP certificate store. So here you can see a couple of the WSE certificates which you can use for the X509 based quick start that ships with WSE. In this case, we're just going to choose username for our signature, and we aren't going to choose any encryption. The encryption options are exactly the same as the signature options, and of course, rather than signing the document, they encrypt the document. So what we're doing here is we're creating a policy file, and when we press finish, what happens is the policy file gets added to BizTalk Server. So in fact, if we go and have a look in the command prompt and browse into the BizTalk Server WSE directory, which is named Microsoft BizTalk Server Adapter for WSE, and then go and have a look in the policy directory, you'll see here we have a policy config file. This policy config file contains all of the policies that the BizTalk Server service is going to use to call out to a WSE secured web service. So BizTalk Server has this policy file. Once we've done that, then BizTalk Server takes the metadata to call that web service and imports it into the design service and starts this off for an orchestration. So the request and the response to that stock quote are automatically added into the BizTalk editor. If you'll recall from Internet Explorer, the request message takes a symbol, and it can be multiple repeating symbols, and the response message takes a stock quote. And if I go into my orchestration, now let's go ahead and hook up this orchestration so it's interacting with the web service. First, I'm going to receive a message from somewhere. I'll show you in a minute a pre-cooked orchestration where I just pick up a message from a file system. And then what I want to do is send it to the secure web service and receive the response. So I drop in a send shape and a receive shape. Next thing we want to do is really hook up that port to the WSE web service. So let's plug the WSE web service directly into this orchestration. So we'll choose a new configured port, press next, give my port a name. Maybe this is my WSE stock port. Go ahead and press next again, and then subsequently use an existing port type. And here you can see we've already imported the WSDL from the WSE-based web service. It's already available to us. We know that it's a request response web service. We need to make sure that we've set the port direction here so that we're going to first send a message to this web service and then subsequently receive a response. And we'll worry about the binding a little later. If you're familiar with the same experience with the ASP.NET web services infrastructure, what you will have seen is that we typically put you in the specify now mode where the transport is defaulted to SOAP and you can't edit it. This dialog box isn't extensible in this version of the product. So with the WSE-based adapter, you're already in a specify later experience. And so we'll go and specify a send port in a minute. So let's go through this experience, press next, finish. And now, of course, I can go hook up my send and hook up my receive in my orchestration itself. So just like that, by adding a reference in here, going ahead and adding the reference through add generated items, and then by creating a new configured port, I have enabled my business process to send, using in this case a username password token, to a web service that is exposed using WS security and WS policy. There's one final step we need to do now at the transport level. Because these business processes are very abstract and I should be able to change the URLs without changing the business process itself, I've also created the second half of my port. If you want to think about the orchestration side as being the logical port, the physical part of the port inside the BizTalk Explorer. And I've selected the WSE adapter, which is the transport, and I've plugged in that same URL that we used previously when we were going ahead and accessing the web service for getting metadata in. Here you can see the URL. And then what I've done is I've actually entered in this signature information. This is the information that I'm going to use in terms of validation of the username and password on the web service. So I've entered in a username of Fabricam, and I've used my little password generation app here to create a password and dropped it into this username token section. So you can see I'm setting up my username token on my physical port. I can also set connection timeouts, retries. If I was doing encryption, I would do the same thing with the username token as well. So that sets up the physical port, the logical port, and then also the sending to the web service. So building this out using techniques that are pretty straightforward and explained in other webcasts, what I've done in this completed orchestration is first receive a file from a file receive. Once I've received that file is actually a stock quote request. I'm sending that out to my WSE port using username password authentication. The WSE port web service is returning me back a response, and then I'm writing the file back to the file system. So let's have a look and see how that works at runtime. So first, let's take a look at the stock service message. Here you can see the stock service message. It has a couple of symbols in it. I'm going to pass this message to the file system into an orchestration, out to the web service, use the authentication credentials for Fabricam plus the password, get the response back, and then write it out. And the way I do that is by copying that stock service message into the in directory. Once it's in the in directory, I'll paste it in there. The BizTalk server receive location will pick it up, put it into a receive port, put it into the orchestration. That orchestration will subsequently send it to that secure web service use the username password authentication. Subsequently, that web service will return a response, and the response is then dropped out here as the document target. And there you can see the result of that, which is our quote for Fabricam and our quote for Contosio. So the really key thing here is with the BizTalk Server Extensible Adapter Framework, the ability to call a secure web service is very, very similar to calling a standard ASP.NET web service. I go ahead and in this case add a generated items as opposed to add web reference, create a configured port, create the logical port, and I get to take advantage of all of the other functionality that you'd expect with BizTalk Server. For example, if I bring up the tracking infrastructure, let's do that, I can see by running a query the most recent business processes that have run on my system. Here is that business process that we just completed. If I go into the message flow view, then we'll be able to see the path that that message has taken as it's gone from the file system up through to a business process. There it is being picked up from the WSE, from the file system, sent out through the WSE adapter. The URL that we were talking to, once again secured, is available to us. And of course, the file is saved out through a file system as well. So I can get this full tracking capability either at the message level or at the orchestration level, which is pretty important because now I can take these web services that may be secured and create a business process around them and track the interactions across them from an end-to-end perspective. But what I've shown you here is really only half of what the WSE adapter for BizTalk Server 2.0 provides, and that is the consumption of secure web services. We can also go ahead and take business processes and make them available as secure web services. So let's just change to a different demo and take a look at what that looks like. So we're now back inside VisualStudio.net in a second demonstration. And what you see here is the Orchestration Designer. And inside the Orchestration Designer, I have a single port, which I've labeled my WSE import, which will receive a request from a web service customer. That request will go into this business process. We'll do some business logic. In this case, it's very simple business logic, taking that request message and creating a response message. And then subsequently, we send that response back to the web service caller. So the pattern here that I really created is a request response web service. And of course, before the WSE 2.0 adapter, I could build a web service that sits in front of this business process in ASP.NET and call this business process as a web service. But what if I want to call this business process now securely using the WSE 2.0 infrastructure? How do I do that? Well, you can do that in exactly the same way, or at least very similarly, that you did previously. You can see we've got a new item here on my toolbar, which is the BizTalk WSE Web Services Publishing Wizard, as opposed to the previous version, which was the BizTalk Web Services Publishing Wizard. And when I select that particular wizard, it brings up an experience which will enable me to create a WSE proxy that will sit in front of my BizTalk server web service to enable me to use things like WS security. So let's go ahead and press next. I can publish an orchestration as a web service, or I could do a schema just as the previous version of this wizard will do so. Automatically has selected my assembly that contains my orchestration that I've compiled down to MSIL. The wizard then goes ahead and queries that assembly and looks for any publicly exposed ports. The WSE port in my design surface, this port right here, is now available to be exposed as a web service. I press next, and once I press next, I move through, and in a minute we'll select some options and then choose the settings for things like security on this web service itself. So first of all, we'll give it a namespace, SharePoint sign-on support if we want. We don't need that for this example. And then subsequently, I'm back here in the exact same dialog box that I was when I was consuming a web service, but now I'm creating a policy for this orchestration I've exposed as a web service. If I wanted to expose it using a username token signature, I would do so as there, press next, give my web service a particular name for its proxy project, create the web service locations anonymously because I'm a developer and I want to keep that easy. Of course, I would maybe provide digest security or some level of authentication in a production site, and create my receive locations, press next, and the project is then created. We've actually already done the next finish experience, so let's go and have a look on IaaS. So now what you see in IaaS is I have my publish proxy project already created, and inside my publish proxy project is this .ashx file. One of the many new things about the WSE infrastructure is you can host it inside ASMX or outside ASMX for port 80 or other transports. So our proxy here is created using the WSE hosting model, which are these ASHX files. And if I point my web browser to it, you can see here is the WSDL for this web service. So as simply as running my WSE web service wizard on top of my business process that I defined inside the BizTalk orchestration environment, I can take this business process and make it immediately available as a secure web service. So that really complements both sides of the equation, consuming secure web services and exposing them.
So I hope you've enjoyed that little segment demo where we showed how you can consume very easily secure web services directly inside BizTalk server, and then go ahead and take business process orchestrations and expose them as secure web services for any client to use. The BizTalk server team is really committed to providing the best experience for creating business process and web services solutions, both today and in the future. Take care.